Hello, welcome back to Scriptural Analysis, the Law of the Covenant. This is Video 3, Part 8, the Abrahamic Covenant. The purpose of Video 8 and 9 will be to point out the interaction of Jehovah in Abraham's life experiences. This will be done briefly and simply in order that we may move to the more descriptive final summary and conclude the Abrahamic Covenant portion of this series. Let's get started. Abraham's life was filled with many recorded adventures, and as the reader analyzes Abraham's experiences, it becomes apparent that the authors have used Abraham's life experience to educate the reader in identifying the pathway all individuals must take to bring themselves out of the world which is termed Babylon, to empower themselves sufficiently enough spiritually that they will be able to endure the loyalty tests in life that are necessary to pass the test required to return to the presence of God according to God's governance structure. These personal life tests require that all individuals either choose between leaving Babylon the world and living within the terms of the law of the covenant, which boundaries are set by God, or staying in Babylon the world and not living the terms of the law of the covenant, but rather living terms created by themselves. In simpler words, Babylon the world is like a laboratory where humanity's life occurs in order to identify, by individual actions and choices, what really is important to each person. In every timeline, the world has offered many distractions designed to cause humanity to look away from Jehovah's governance and become preoccupied with worldly pursuits. In order to find what God really requires of each individual, all will have to undergo personal sacrifice away from worldly desires and pursuits to get on the correct path and stay on it for the duration of time, time being identified as one's lifetime, from birth to death. The objective of this video will be to point out the dual nature of the author's writings in recording Abraham's life experience, and in sharing God's governance plan for Abraham. Identifying how Abraham, following of Jehovah's directions, created life experiences that formulated corresponding life tests for Abraham. These life tests then created conditions that strengthened Abraham spiritually rather than just temporally meaning in the world. This increased spiritual strength then allowed Abraham to recreate himself as a better version of himself, according to the personal decision-making opportunities within God's perfect plan. This same opportunity to recreate a better version of one's self is available to all females and males that have ever lived. After Abraham nearly lost his life to the idol-worshipping class of he was instructed by Jehovah to leave his country, his kindred, and his father's household, and go to a land he was to be shown. This land would be the land of Canaan, and would be the land designated for covenant promise made to Abraham's posterity. It is important to note that Jehovah himself instructed Abraham to go. Abraham did not decide for himself to go, and then rationalize his decision by thinking that God would probably want him to do it. This needs to be understood, as this ideology is the foundation for the creation of many religions. By receiving Jehovah's direction to go, we know two things about Abraham. Number one, Abraham had previously lived his life in such a way that he knew the covenant conditions whereby God deals with humanity, and he lived perfectly within the terms of the covenant to achieve the status whereby he earned the ability to join God's governance team and discuss things with God and or God's servants while in his earth life. And number two, Abraham at this time in his life would have already understood that although there were similarities between the structures of earthly governance and God's governance, Abraham knew the absolute reality in the great divide between the two. Abraham had no desire in his life to participate in earthly promotion or governance. He was not interested in participating in any form of idle accumulation, defined as Babylon, the world's distractions, in any form, not just statues. He lived nomadic, away from the cities, and focused on life sustainability for his family and servants, choosing only to follow the governance of God patiently in all things. As such, even though Abraham lived on the earth, he did not excuse himself to live the way accepted by the systems of the earth and pursue the things of the earth. Instead, he willingly chose to live God's law, a God whom the authors have declared does not have his kingdom on the earth at this time, and pursued the eternal gifts of God's kingdom. Of note, so you do not get confused, God's kingdom not being on the earth is not the same as God's law and governance not being on the earth. God's kingdom will only exist on the earth when he installs his governance system after resetting the current system of governance found today. This is the message of the authors. As for God's law and governance, those have always been on the earth and available for adoption into all individual lives by their authority in choice. Now compare God's command to a worthy individual who has earned their own reward to the ideology of humanity deciding for themselves, or even in conjunction with others, as to what God wants. There cannot be a greater extreme. In Abraham's example, Abraham represents a type of person who has earned through their choices and actions the magnification of their individual status to make their calling and election in God's governance opportunity sure. In humanity deciding for themselves what God wants, these also represent a type. However, this type is of a person who creates a God patterned after themselves and their beliefs, usually for their specific gain to enjoy some distractions found in Babylon. This type offers similar patterns of the law of the covenant in their ideology and incorporate anywhere from 0.01% to 99.9% of God's law of the covenant in their actions, but never 100%. And so, a new religion is formed. By Abraham following what God had told him to do, he has ensured the temporal and eternal promises of the covenant, P cubed, to be with him. And so, Abraham left for Canaan. As for Ur of the Chaldeans, the covenant curse of famine hit the idolatrous land and wreaked havoc with the lives of all life, including human, plant, and animal. But for Abraham, his family, and his flocks that he traveled with, they all received covenant blessings and were untouched by the famine of the land. It should also be noted that Abraham's family, who just casually gave their attention to what God had instructed of them, but also mingled with some of the idols of Babylon for their personal pleasure, did not follow Abraham and suffered in the famine, actively placing themselves outside of the possibility for divine covenant protection. This was to be the beginning of Jehovah's instructing Abraham on what to do or where to go during certain parts of Abraham's long life after he left his father's house. And many great and exciting written works provide the reader an in-depth look at the development of God's governing foundation, starting through his servant Abraham. But to hear those, you will have to join me for Video 3, Part 9, which will wrap up our dealings with the life of Abraham. Thanks for tuning in. I look forward to you joining me for Video 3, Part 9, where I continue to finalize the teachings from the writings about what we can learn from the author's history of Abraham and how it applies to us in God's governance structure. Until next time, take care and contemplate these things.